designed to give students the opportunity to explore different career options and gain some industry insights in a variety of fields. And today's being corporate finance and learning from our panelists who are in the industry and have gone through the recruiting process and worked in the industry before to get some insights from them. And so today we want this panel to be as interactive as possible. So when I do open up the panel for audience questions later on, please indicate that you have a question by either raising your hand or turning on your microphone and when welcome, then turning on your camera because we do prioritize students who are a bit more interactive. And just to get started, here's the agenda for today. We have panelist introductions and then a discussion, which is a list of moderated questions before going to student Q&A, which is going to be a group session, and then finally going on to closing remarks. So just to start, these are our wonderful panelists here today. And I can't see, has Grant joined? But if not, if we can have all of our panelists introduce ourselves. Lindy, do you want to get started?
Yeah, hi everyone. It's nice to meet you. Let me move you to the right screen here. Yeah, so do you want me to just kind of give brief overview, background, that kind of stuff?
Your
Great.
background, experience here a little bit, just a little bit into your.
Yep. Yep. So not, I think as most of this audience, it's all is everyone undergrad? Is anyone undergrad? Yeah. Okay, nice. Great. Cool. So my name is Lindy. I am currently a strategic finance manager at The Honest Company. So a lot of people might think of that as like the diaper company. It was Jessica Alba was one of the founders of the company. Right now we do kind of baby personal care, adult personal care, diapers, and then wipes. So I actually went to the University of Oregon for my undergrad and studied business there. I'm from Oregon originally. After undergrad, I moved up to Seattle and worked at Nordstrom's corporate headquarters for 5 years. That's where they're based in Seattle. And there I was in kind of a few different roles. The most interesting, I think, and kind of the most applicable to finance is I was in corporate strategy at that company. And that is kind of what led me to going back to business school, which I did a couple of years ago at USC. So that is my connection to Marshall and to USC. Graduated from there and went into consulting, which, kind of common path post MBA, but also with a corporate strategy background, those kind of roles and functions go hand in hand. And did that for a couple of years, primarily working in the consumer practice. So really have like that retail consumer background. And most recently joined the Honest Company in January of this year. I don't know kind of what other individuals pass on the panel. I'll be interested to hear, but this is my first, you could call it like pure finance role. I'd say there's so much of consulting and corporate strategy is analytical and financial. That's a big part of it. But yeah, kind of a first pure play finance role for me. So excited to be here and answer questions about the industry, about company, and also kind of just, I guess, non-traditional paths into finance. So I think that's how I would classify by my path. So excited to be here and yeah, looking forward to chatting and answering any questions.
Thank you so much, Lindy. And I did see that Grant joined. Just to catch you up. Hi, Grant. We are just starting the panel. I'm really glad you could make it. If you'd wanted to introduce yourself to our students today.
Yeah, of course. I'm so sorry I'm late. Duty calls. Still in the office, as you can see. So my name is Grant. I work at Legendary Entertainment. We produce and co-fi movies from Dune to Minecraft, some of the older like Batman Begins, Inception, and I work in the corporate finance department. And so we do some of the strategy, some of the M&A, we do some of the corporate finance and the green light models for film and TV. We're a very small team, and so that's why we get to cross so many different departments. And yeah, it's a great company and it's a great experience that I am so fortunate to be at because of USC. I started off as like a finance econ major at the University of Nevada, Reno. And I got in there and I just hated finance. I was like, this is the worst thing in the world. I can't stand it. I hate Excel. I don't know what I'm doing. And I just stumbled upon a like film class and fell in love. And sent a Hail Mary to USC to try and get into entertainment, and somehow I got in, and right away I went straight to the finance side of film and fell in love with it. I don't know, it was just a perfect synergy of what I wanted between entertainment and finance, and now this is kind of where I'm at. And so I'm very happy that I was invited into this panel and very excited to connect with anyone from USC as a fellow Trojan.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And we'll move on to Lydia and then finish off with Jonathan.
Hi everyone, my name is Lydia, and I'm currently a manager at the FP&A department at Optum United Health Group. So if you have used United Insurance, you might be familiar with the brand. It basically has like two part of the business. One part is like the insurance side, and the other part is where M sits is Optum, where it offers like care delivery, and then the goal is to like through data analytics and technology, we're going to make the healthcare more accessible and easier for everyone. So my main responsibilities is like looking at our like current strategies and of like saving, cost cutting, and then looking at like how we can manage our profits, and also working with a lot of the clinics to make sure they are like performing to the par and meeting all the financial goals. And then so prior to this role, I had graduated from USC in 2018, and after graduation, I had experiences working in various industries, including Disney and then like Amgen. So I had a little like background from like different industries, and then I found out that healthcare industry is still like is very mission driven, and there's a lot of like challenging items every day due to like regulatory like environments and then a lot of moving parts. So that's where I decided that I will grow my career. So I joined Optum, and then so for Optum, the great thing is that like it has a lot of M&A activities, which means that I actually felt like I'm working for different companies throughout these years, is because you will have the job of like, knowing how to when a new like company comes on board, like how to kind of like train them, like going through their financials, and then kind of basically looking at a new P&L for a brand new company and how they can kind of integrate well to the existing like USG or slash Optum like financials. So I think that part brings a lot of excitement to the job, and happy to share more about the finance industry, and nice meeting you.
Thank you so much. Nice to meet you. Let's finish off with Jonathan.
Great. Well, hello everybody. This is Jonathan. I think I momentarily froze, but I went to USC from 2014 to 2018 and was heavily involved in TIS mentorship and multiple fraternities and clubs. So glad all of you are getting ahead in advance here. I started actually my career in investment banking as an intern. I stayed on as an analyst and I did a generalist program across consumer, aerospace, business services, pretty much everything but TMT. I stayed on as an analyst to associate, so decided to forego my MBA and did an associate program specifically in consumers. So I covered anywhere from pet services to consumer products, consumer, pretty much anything in consumer. And finished up my associate years, realized I didn't want to do investment banking for the rest of my life, but I had gotten like a good amount of transactional experience. So I started experimenting a little bit with startups, took a little bit of a break as well, and actually ended up in the same tower. So I work actually at the US Bank Towers. That was where I did investment banking, and that's where I'm at now, in strategic finance at Cloud Kitchens. And so really interesting role. I think I did a lot of like external transactions, and so they'll use me if they're being acquisitive, but I now get to see more of the operational day to day and build a long term strategy versus when you're in investment banking and you're engaged more within like these 1 year engagements. You don't get to see sometimes some of the things that you build out actually come to fruition. So that's pretty much it, but happy to be here.
Thank you so much for all your introductions. And then now moving to the second part of our panel, which is a moderated Q&A. I had these sent to our panelists in advance, and they're more targeted, but I think a lot of these questions really do apply to many of you. So if any of you want to hop in after about your insights on the questions. So we'll first get started with Grant. So Grant, after you finished your bachelor's degree in finance and economics, as you mentioned, you came to USC to get your master's in film and TV production. What inspired you to make this shift, and how did deviating from the quote unquote normal finance path change the trajectory of your career?
Yeah, I think honestly, I was inspired by another Trojan, Ryan Coogler, who is the director of Black Panther and Creed. As many of you know, he went to USC and he actually started off as a finance major as well, and then pivoted into film. And I was a little woefully ignorant, thinking, oh, I could do the same thing as Ryan Coogler. But I followed his path and deviated from finance into this entertainment realm. And I think it drastically changed my career trajectory because I didn't go the traditional like IB or consulting route as a lot of like my coworkers did. But I kind of liked the path I went because I was more exposed to filmmaking and production and development and kind of the front side of what film is versus we are very much on the back side of the finance side. And so it's a nice kind of synergy to be able to put the two together and bring a different perspective to my team than, your traditional IB or consulting or accounting CPA firm, like that kind of like division, I say. And I don't think it's like a correct path or a bad path, but it's just the path I took and it ended up working out in my favor.
Lindy, you also mentioned introduction. You didn't think you had the most straightforward path getting into finance. If you wanted to talk about that a little bit and your background in consulting, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I've worked in a lot of different functions, and I think a lot of that, as Grant mentioned, it's just like happened to be my path. I don't think there was a right path or a wrong path. But yeah, so I started my career in brand at Nordstrom, which is a retail company. So kind of the overarching umbrella of consumer. Have always been really interested in like the consumer products, whether that's retail or like true CPG. Just really motivated by like what gets people to buy. I like to buy things. I think the psychology of like why people buy what they buy is really interesting. What's going on in the economy, consumer spending. But like I also really like fashion. So like retail was like a really great kind of first place for me. And then it's kind of like, you have your industries, right? But then you also have your functions like within each company and where you see fit. So starting in brand, I think was a really fun place to start my career. I was young, straight out of college, got to like work on a lot of cool events and with fun brands and a lot of travel. But I think what was missing for me and kind of a gap was kind of more of that, not that brand can be analytical, but I really wanted to like hone in on a lot of those analytical skills, which I felt like I was kind of missing. And so, I think you can pivot between companies, but you can also pivot within big companies, right? To like kind of not make it scary and have to like go completely new industry, new company, new function. But so I use that to pivot into corporate strategy within Nordstrom. And corporate strategy is basically like, I think a lot of people know of like management consulting, right? Like you're working on big problems, people are hiring you. You can think of like corporate strategy as kind of you do that, but just like in your company. So like whenever there's big issues or opportunities facing the company, it's that team that's really hired, right? We already work there, but to kind of go address those issues. And I think then for me, I was thinking maybe I'd be interested actually like in healthcare, kind of the intersection of consumer and healthcare. But having only ever really done retail, I was like, an MBA would be a really good opportunity. I think MBAs can be really helpful when you're making to make a big pivot of industry or of function. And so I think without going into my MBA, it would have been really hard to pivot into management consulting, even though I worked in corporate strategy, which is like similar kind of skills. And so I really think like an MBA could be really helpful for those reasons. And then, kind of corporate strategy and consulting have a lot of similar skill sets. And while they're not purely finance in nature, they're really quantitative roles. There's a lot of finance within them. And so, I think for me, I kind of always call it like building my little like CEO skill set. Like I'm trying to have all these different experiences and different functions to just make me a more well-rounded business person because I do want to work up and eventually, be an executive, whether that's a CFO or a chief strategy officer or ultimately a CEO. I think kind of gathering different functions of experience across your career can make a lot of sense, which is kind of what I'm doing. Might not look clear on paper or in my head sometimes, but that's kind of what I got going on.
And that kind of leads us to our next question for you, Lindy. You already covered it a little bit, but how has getting an MBA really impacted the path of your career? And do you think it's shaped it in a certain way moving forward? And generally, how do you think students should approach if they want to pursue an MBA in the future? Whether they know it's right for them, and do you think it's essential for moving forward in their careers?
Yeah. So I think I have a lot of opinions on MBAs. I think for me personally, it was something that was always kind of a goal of mine. So that's something worth noting. Like it was always something I kind of saw as part of my path. I think it became more evident the impact that an MBA can have. When I worked on the corporate strategy team at Nordstrom, all of those individuals were all like all had MBAs, were all ex-consultants, and they were like the smartest people I had ever worked with. And so I was like, okay, there's got to be something to this MBA and consulting kind of path. I think in hindsight, I think maybe straight out of undergrad would be like a really great time to go into something like management consulting or into like an investment banking or corporate finance role. I think those roles, like the first few years out of undergrad, if you can like really build that analytical skill set, it just can set you up for so much more success. Like I think it's a lot harder to do what I did, which is like go from brand and marketing into these analytical functions. Whereas if you start in the analytical, those are just like skills that everyone's always coveted. And then you could use that to pivot. You're like, I really do want to try marketing or product or something else. I think it's so much easier to pivot between companies and even industries if you have that really strong analytical kind of background. So I think in hindsight, I probably would have gone into like, finance or consulting straight out of undergrad. But for me, I think the MBA kind of really was essential to make that pivot. But if you go into kind of one of those more analytical kind of roles in the beginning, unless you're trying to make some like big drastic change, I mean, again, obviously I went to USC for my MBA and had a great experience, but I would really ask yourself, like, do I really think that I need to get this to get into the types of roles that I want? If not, you might just try to get into it without doing that. Or, a lot of management consulting firms, I know some corporations too, like they offer MBA assistance. There's the financial aspect of it too. Like, am I getting a scholarship? Am I working for a company that's going to help me pay for it? Those are all things to consider, but I think kind of one of my biggest pieces of advice if you're at this panel would be to like go into kind of a more analytical or kind of intense industry right out of undergrad when you kind of don't know the difference, and kind of gain that skill set, because I just think it can really help you set up for success in the future, whether that's going to get your MBA or just making those pivots on your own without an MBA.
Yeah, I know you, after graduating from USC, you went to get your master's in finance instead of doing an MBA. Can you talk a little bit about your experience and what inspired you to get an advanced degree, but not necessarily an MBA?
Yeah, so for my it's more like specific. So I'm an international student. So I actually like part of the reason is because I wanted to leverage the additional degree like in STEM to have obtained the like the OPT period. So that was one reason. And I think the second reason is that I felt like out of college, I wasn't sure like what industry I wanted to go into. I think at that time I also had done like a couple internships. I've tried like hedge fund, I've tried like IB, and I also tried like kind of the traditional like corporate finance in the corporate world. So I wasn't sure like what path where my passion lies. So that's the reason why like I kind of it was a 1 year program, so I just spent another year for like recruiting, and it also buys you time for recruiting if you haven't decided your mind as well. So I think it was just the right timing of like, having an extra year of like recruiting, and I definitely felt like, just having that kind of leverage really separate you out from like other candidates, for example, like in their like junior or senior year, because essentially you guys will still be kind of applying for like the same position. It's kind of different from MBA because I know MBA usually would have their like, oh, MBA positions or MBA interns or MBA positions. But then if you get a regular master, you kind of essentially are still competing with people just fresh out of college. But then you have that extra year of layer of the experience, and then like so that kind of would give you a advantage of like in the recruiting. And I felt like just in terms of like just the coursework, it's going to be more like focused in like hardcore finance. I think in Marshall, like it's more of like for the a lot of the items like it's electives, right? You can take classes in the areas you're interested, but then in like a master program, it's more like whether or not you're interested in this specific area of finance, you have to like learn it. I think also gives you different perspectives of just setting up that business foundation in finance, and then like kind of give you more insights into like, what are like the career different like options like working in the industry. And I just want to wrap up. I think the other good thing of like enrolling the program is that a lot of the professors are like working in the industry. I know that Marshall has great professors. And then like there's also some professors that are in the industry. But then I think for the specific program I attended, a lot of the professors are, MDs at the bank or, so I think it's a great way to kind of just connect with them and then just establish that more intimate relationship with those professionals inside of the industry.
Thank you so much for your responses. And also, this next question is for you, Lydia. But I do think that when it comes to recruiting, all of you would have really great inputs for students who are probably going through the process right now. So, what trend, Lydia, you worked in corporate finance for most of your career, even though it was in different industries. So, what trends do you see arising in the future, and how can our students take advantage of knowing these trends when recruiting or beginning their early careers?
I think for first and foremost is definitely data and technology integration. I felt like nowadays, even though like people are different majors, right? But all the passes kind of you have to know some kind of CS. You have to know some computer science in order to succeed in any role now because all the industries, including finance, are like data based, like data driven. So like whether you're, looking at like the financials of a company or if you're looking at to, acquire, like all the data part is where you should be able to have the ability to kind of like clean the data, being able to understand. So like the data and technology part, I think is like a huge like being able to know like how to even though like there will always be teams that supports you for the data, right? But having that ability to like digging yourself and building things from scratch would definitely be a plus. And so knowing some like coding skills such as like Python or SQL would definitely like shine in any industry recruiting. And then the second relate to that is like visualization tools. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with like, Power BI, Tableau. So like the next step, right, is that you have data and then now you're going to wanted to show in an easy way to convey the message. So like having the skills in those tools will really set you apart. So like showing that, oh, like, how to like aggregate the data and then like show them in like kind of visualize them in a visualization way. And I think the third is would about like in finance, you're always going to be a strategic partner, whether you are, trying to like be a partner to your internal clients or external clients. So like the ability to tell a good story or slash drive insights from the data is the key. So you have to be able to be a good storyteller and, being able to either like sell your ideas to the clients, right? Or just really like helping the CEO to like solve a problem. You have to have the ability to like a good communicator, right? But also a great storyteller to drive like key insights from the data. And then I think the last one I'll close it with like scenario planning and then kind of risk management is because for finance, a lot of the cases is that you have to do a lot of like scenario modeling and also looking at the risk side. So having the ability to like just not just work on things that you're being told, right? But think about out of the box and think about what else could happen and just prepare and model those scenarios as well. That would be like very helpful in any kind of analysis.
Thank you for those. And if any of our other panelists have any, recruiting tips you could share about trends that you see that our students can take advantage of as they're going through the recruiting process, feel free to take the floor.
I would say, so I headed up recruitment for investment banking, intern, analyst, and associate levels. You would be totally surprised if people continue to forget how important just networking, all the basics are. I think especially now that all these AI tools pop up and everything, you will see that a lot of people can't tell their story correctly, can't do some of the basics that you would see before. So I say I got involved in lean recruiting for banking probably from 2019 to 2024. You would see that change. So you would see, like, example, resumes are maybe more competitive now. People have more internships, but you would see a simple story like, "Hey, can you walk through your resume?" It would be a lot more disjointed and things like that. So I think things like that, and then LinkedIn and just networking. So you go to USC, like it's going to be really helpful.
Just continuing with you, Jonathan. So you said you began your career in investment banking before going into strategic finance. And I think a lot of people going to investment banking, a lot of students envisioning what they want to do in the future, but they might not know what that looks like. So, what advice would you give to students who are trying to decide what area of finance they want to pursue, perhaps after banking or just generally in the future, and what kind of field or path is right for them?
Yeah, I actually like the way Lindy put it, which was like you're kind of trying to be a CEO, and I think versatility in the future will kill. And you've seen like historically people just go into banking, consulting, kind of stay in it, maybe switch firms or trying to make partner. But these combination of versatility skill sets are becoming more and more prominent. And so, as an example, one thing advice for everyone here, this whole A to B to B to C to D, and it has to be in this order in this way is so not true. So it's like, people tell you have to do 2 years of banking, then you go private equity. I could still switch over to private equity now if I wanted to. I could go back to banking. I decided to skip my MBA. I could decide to get my MBA now. It's a lot more fluid than you think it is. So I made the switch personally to strategic finance so I could get more versatility of skill sets. So if you're choosing your career now, choose something you really like, maybe an industry you like, or you can go broad. Like that's why I did investment banking, M&A generalist. I had no idea what industry I liked. I had no idea what I wanted to do, but I knew investment banking was like a good place to start. And then later on in my career, I chose like consumer as an example.
So that concludes our general questions, and I want to pass it on to our students. If you have any questions that are for a specific panelist or just in general, any advice that you want to get answered, please try to turn your cameras on and raise your virtual hand. Students with their camera on will get priority, and if you can, please do try to speak to them to create some interaction, but we will also be monitoring chat. So I'll open the floor up to any students who'd like to ask any questions. And so I think Tashima, I see you have your hand up if you wanted to ask.
Hi, I'm Ashma. Thanks so much for coming. Really loved hearing everyone speak. My question's more generally for Lydia, but also would love to hear from any other panelists that would want to chime in. I'm really considering working in FP&A because I want to work in a finance role that is not just limited to, just looking at numbers, but working uh behind like the business operation. So do you find yourself really working with other departments within your firm and really having that cross collaboration?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that is kind of the foremost job of like FP&A is kind of really bring everyone together because you are basically the end person of, kind of going to represent like the company's financials and being kind of responsible for, you won't be responsible for the entire, right? But you will be assigned to like, for example, a specific region or a specific category that you'll be responsible for the holistics of the financials. So a lot of the day to day is, working closely with the business partners, which would be the internal clients, right? Like, so in my case, would be a lot of the clinics and our doctors, like operators, to making sure that, like working with them, making sure that, they understand what's the performance is and then helping them to find like opportunities to like increase our revenue or like cost cutting. And then the other part is that we also work like very closely with like the operations and like also like accounting and then a lot of like the data like for healthcare is the healthcare analytics and then the healthcare economics. So it's essentially like you have to kind of work with different teams in order to get the insights you need for, what drives the company's performance, right? What drives like the revenue and what drives like kind of the cost. So you need to have all the like versatility in like the different perspectives of the business in order to kind of do your forecast and come out with a good story to tell the leadership. And then a lot of times you'll kind of be dragged into like ad hoc stuff, right? Whether, for example, it's like, oh, like if we have a contract, right? Whether like the pricing of the contract, like whether we wanted to like kind of acquire or like kind of end the term with a doctor. So kind of that more of like specific in my industry. So a lot of those analysis also requires kind of like industry experts opinion. So yeah, to answer your question, it does. It's kind of the core of FP&A is that you have to be a people person and really being a great partner to, different teams so that, while you help them, they also like help you to find out, what's driving all the financials behind the business.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you. That was very helpful.
And Anthony, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah. I just want to thank you guys all for attending today and sharing with us your guys' career journeys. I'm a senior at USC Marshall. I've completed an internship in FP&A at like a tech company, and I'm interested in going to FP&A and kind of strategic finance after grad. And I have been seeing more and more strategic finance things kind of just on my radar. Like this question is basically for anybody, but if you guys could explain maybe like the core differences between like a traditional corporate finance, FP&A versus strategic finance, and as a student, like what are the best skills, practices, mindsets to be honing in on to kind of excel in a more strategic role?
Yeah, I'm happy to take first pass with Linda. I think another strategic finance P probably has.
No,
I'll let
go
her go
ahead.
first
Go
and I
ahead,
can fill it
Jonathan.
in.
Go ahead first.
I would say that it really depends on your company. Strategic finance is very new. So that's the first thing. So I would say like for us, we have an FP&A team, we have a strategic finance team, we have an accounting team, we have a financial systems team. And so really strategic finance you're doing like kind of quality check FP&A work maybe 15% of the time, 10, 20% of the time, and then you're really building out strategy, right? And so even at bigger companies, you might even see like a corp dev team, which means you're building only the inorganic growth strategy. It's really different ways. It could be you're doing it for a team. It could be if it has like multiple subsidiaries, you're doing it for like one subsidiary. They did an add-on acquisition. Now they have, let's say, three. So they have three different strategies. So there's different like strat-fin teams for each. So it really depends.
Yeah, I think it does depend on company. Like the Honest Company is quite small. So like I do kind of like some of the traditional FP&A types of things as well as the strategic things, just because like we're a small company. Relative to some of like the big companies that you know, right? Big tech companies, big retailers, those types of things. I think my advice, like straight out of undergrad, is like if you like the company and the role seems interesting, I would just take it. I wouldn't put a ton of thought into like FP&A versus like strategic finance right away. I think maybe if you're just kind of looking to like build the basics, you could maybe more easily do that in FP&A first, kind of like build up that muscle of like those really traditional finance skills, and then kind of iterate to your manager or to your team, like I'm really interested in these more like strategic types of projects. And maybe you can like be put on a stretch project while still in a more traditional FP&A role, and like move into strategic finance at your company or at a different company later on. I think maybe just like, again, I wouldn't be picky choosy. Like if you're going between one or the other, I don't think you can go wrong. But if you kind of want like a pure finance skill set, like maybe starting with FP&A might be better.
Yeah. And the only thing I'll add on, and that's literally spot on. I think anything as long as it's analytical and people don't like forget about this, but when people talk about culture and all these things, I chose a firm that I knew that the people at the mid-level were going to mentor me well because it was a 40, 50 person office. Everybody knew each other. That was instrumental for the beginning of my career, right? That's why I chose to go to LA, smaller versus like New York, 200 analysts per bank. Here, I knew it was like one of five. And so it just really depends, right? You give up prestige, but I built out those skill sets, and then that is instrumental because if you're going to go to Stratfin, and I just finished recruitment, 5, 6 months ago, every single place case studied me, and so that's becoming something where only really investment banking used to do that when I recruited in undergrad. Now pretty much every firm is going to have that. And so things have changed. So I would say like if you like an office and you've like potentially your manager a lot and they're going to invest in you, that's something to also take into consideration, especially for entry level.
Yeah. Thank you both for that. Those are really good points. And I guess it really is kind of blurrier than it seems and very firm dependent, I guess. Yeah. Thank you guys so much.
We'll move on to Amelia with your question.
Hi, I'm Emilio. Thanks for you guys for coming today. I just wanted to learn more about like, I guess like the work-life balance specifically, because I'm a freshman right now, so I'm still trying to like explore and trying to like, hear different insights and experiences. So just wanted to learn more about like, I guess your guys' like work life and just like work-life balance.
I can chime in just, I think I have an interesting experience of like client services and in-house. So in-house you can think of as like when you work for one company. So like I worked for Nordstrom, I worked for the Honest Company, versus when you work in client services, right? Like in consulting or in investment banking, a company is hiring your team to do work. I think there is inevitably with that, right? Less work-life balance than when you work in one company. And that's just like a generalization, right? That could obviously depend a lot on the company that you're working for, what's going on at the company, right? But I'd say in general, like client services types of roles, so management consulting, investment banking are typically thought about having, longer hours, maybe not as much work-life balance than like, working internal at one company. But that's just been my experience.
I will more than agree and double down actually as an investment banker. You will work a lot. And so I think you need to make sure that you really understand what you want to get into it for, get out of it and everything. Ironically, I actually, as a freshman, didn't want to do investment banking. and ended up wanting to do it later on. I started as a CS major. And these kind of panels and coffee chats and joining AKSI and talking to upperclassmen helped me kind of decide that. But I won't sugarcoat it for you. I would say much better work-life balance now. When I was investment banking, not so much.
But if there's ever time to do it, it's like right out of undergrad, in my opinion, when you kind of don't know any different. Like, obviously
100% right.
prioritize your well-being, but like I did kind of the client services role, when I was almost 30 years old, I had a lot of work-life balance in my past roles. And so it's kind of hard to go from having that to not. So ignorance is bliss sometimes. So just food for thought there.
100%. I started doing the hours at 22, 23. By my fifth year in investment banking, I was 28. A lot harder to do a really tough week when I was an associate, like, prime grinding hours versus when I was 22, 23 out of college. So 100% agree.
Thank you guys.
We actually had a question in chat, and this one is for Grant specifically. And so this person asked, how has your experience in finance helped you in cinema? And did you initially have an edge over your colleagues due to your financial background?
So you cut off at the last part of it. Can you just repeat the ending part?
And so did you initially have an edge over your colleagues due to your financial background?
Oh, yeah, it's interesting. I think with cinema, I'm in like a completely different realm as everyone else. But still there is some finance to it that is helpful. I think you have to look at movies very differently as you have like your very strict finance side and then your artistic cinema side. And the corporate side in which I work on is mainly green light models. And so what we do is we model out a future film that we want to make, and we look at certain IP. For example, we'll look at Dune, for example, and we're looking at previous movies across the years for the last 10 years. You're looking at Star Wars, you're looking at Star Trek, you're looking at any Marvel movie, and you're building on a model, and it's a waterfall model to see what is your break-even point in this film, and is it worth it to make? And on top of that, you're balancing out what is your top of the line, which is your actors, your directors, your writers. How much is that going to the above the line and then below the line? And figuring out through this model whether or not this film is going to be financially stable for us to produce. And it's interesting because coming from the creative side as well, is a lot of creative people don't think that way. They're thinking more for their artistic balance, I'd say. And so it's kind of like a weird thing where it's finding that perfect synergy between two different departments. We'll work with creative a lot to try and figure out where that middle ground is and balancing out your art versus being a profitable business, because unfortunately movies don't make a lot of money. They're very, very expensive, and I'm sure you see it all the time. For example, this last weekend, Running Man is a huge flop. It's probably going to be an 80 to 90 million dollar loss. So it's a lot of balance and understanding when someone like Denis Villeneuve is going to make Dune 3, when to spend a little bit more money because this is going to be a global impact film versus judging a Joker Part 2 that is going to be your $200 million movie that isn't even going to gross 50. So it's a very big challenge, and I think that's the hardest part about cinema and finance is we can't really test it out like a Nike shoe. We can't take it to a market and test it. It's either you make it or you don't. And that's the hardest part about film finance.
Thank you so much for that. And we have a lot more chat questions to look at. And so this one is from Patrick, who asked Lydia and the whole panel. He works in FP&A and wants to move industry. So how transferable are your skill sets when working in finance in different positions at different companies and industries? And is having a professional portfolio helpful?
Yeah, so I think it's earlier in your career, it's pretty easy to move within this like two different industries for FP&A because like the skills, right? Really like modeling, like you have to. I mean, first you have to show like your industry, right? Like your interest to the industry, wherever like you, whenever like you move industries, you wanted to have a good story to say like why you wanted to move into this industry. So a great story behind your reasoning is a must. And then for the skills, right? Like you'll like your financial modeling skills and analytical skills would apply to like every role in FP&A and also like kind of your ability to partner with like different departments. So those skills are all like transferable. And I felt like a lot of the model building is that you have to kind of it's very industry specific, right? So when you get into the industry, you wanted to learn about, like what are kind of the drivers of this industry and then like the kind of the key like KPIs like they look at and then like that would kind of drive how you would approach like financial modeling like differently. And then I would say like early on in your career, it's great to kind of try out different industries because yes, like I know we've talked about work-life balance. I felt like that also depends on, even though you're going to be in the same corporate role, but it also depends on like the different industry you are, it will definitely impact your like work-life balance for sure. And also kind of how like how fun would the job be? I think just being in healthcare, there's like so many changes and like regulatory issues. And also I think for healthcare, like the technology wise has always been like a challenge, right? There's still kind of like having like paper built claims and stuff. So just on like data and then like technology side, there's so much analysis that we need to do. And then so I think that kind of also like industry dependent. So but then once you're kind of moving along your career, right? If you're like wanting to be like a director or moving into like a CFO position, what I've seen is that you definitely wanted to be focused on one industry and then just very niche in the market so that you will have more like promotional opportunities, like opportunities for promotions for like a higher position within the organization.
Thank you. And I think we'll keep going through some chat questions. And I saw Jonathan did answer a little bit in chat already, but this is from Isabella who asked, did you get your jobs through traditional applications or networking? And if it was through networking, how so?
Yeah, so I always tell people you should have like your networking kind of funnel and then everything else you should still apply. But when it came to investment banking, it was TIS mentorship program and AKSI, right? Very helpful. TI's mentorship program was connecting, you know, upperclassmen. And so when I became time for summer internship, that allowed me to get like interviews in LA. And then it's converting. And then Cloud Kitchens, ironically, I had one of my analysts who left to New York, JP Morgan, to lateral within banking. He knew my now manager from Emory. And so it just happened to be, and so same thing. I was recruiting for strategic finance roles, texting people, and he was like, hey, this used to be where you used to work. It's a pretty big startup. They would like someone like you. And so it worked out, but I always also do the other funnel. So yeah, clubs and everything if you're an undergrad, and then once you start working, I would say be a friend to your colleagues as well and just be an overall good person, whether it be you're managing or whether it be you're working underneath somebody.
And if you want to ask your question, Anthony?
Yeah, I had a question for Grant specifically. I know you mentioned in an earlier question that maybe film forecasting within finance is harder to predict because it's not like you could test something. So I did I'm not sure what your role is on the team, but I did want to ask a little bit more about what that forecasting process looks like because like there is such a wide range of outcomes. So are you guys just kind of doing like a very wide sensitivity analysis, or are you using like other tools or like maybe simulations to try to model how a film will perform?
Yeah. Um, we use different we use different analysis. We'll sometimes, even if it's really drastic enough, we'll do a Monte Carlo. Um, our most basic way, and this is kind of across the industry, is let's say creative buys an IP for a new book and they send over the script. They'll figure out the writing cost and whether or not they want to bid on this, and then they'll take it to finance. And so if we get this book, what we created is a complete, I guess, theatrical database, and we'll take through about 10 to 12 films. And what you're basing it on is the genre. You're basing it on the top talent that if it's attached, for example, let's say like Glenn Powell is attached, we'll take his 5 movies and look at how it does domestically, internationally, and worldwide. And then if you have specific distribution channels like China, you'll look at that box office as well. And basically, what we're doing is writing out a model based on your box office performance and then after what that performance is as well. And so a lot of people don't realize that when you make a movie, yes, it makes money theatrically, but then it also makes money afterwards. And that is your streaming, that is your pay TV, your free TV. And so what we have is a what's called an ultimate, and it's just a P&L, and you're going through that P&L and seeing those different channels from your pay TV, your Netflix, your Hulu, all those different subscriptions. And every quarter, it's showing what kind of like money you're pulling in for that movie based on your library value. And so you're taking all of your action movies, all your drama movies, all your romance movies, and putting it through kind of like that waterfall to see how your movie is going to make theatrically, domestically, internationally, and then your TV windows, whether it's pay or free or streaming. And then from there, it's just you're blasting it across a waterfall and seeing whether or not that's going to be profitable. That's kind of like the main way of most studios do it.
Hmm. That's very interesting. Yeah, thank you for sharing.
And then Ashma, if you wanted to ask your question.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So I wanted to ask Lindy, I know you obviously worked in corporate strategy and then also Jonathan, I think you like very briefly mentioned corporate development. And I'm really interested in, pursuing something very strategy focused like that. So I wanted to ask, especially Lindy, I know you didn't necessarily have a very traditional route into corporate strategy, but do you think that those sort of areas, very like strategy focused areas, are accessible to students, straight out of graduation or undergrad or a few years post grad? Or if not, how would you suggest, one can prepare themselves to go into it?
Yeah, I think what you said is correct. So my path, I would say, is very non-traditional. So like when I joined the corporate strategy team at Nordstrom, I had worked at Nordstrom for 2 years on a different team. And I was like one of the only internal hires onto that team. That team primarily kind of was hiring ex-consultants kind of at all levels. So I'd say, it's kind of hard to be super strategic in a corporation with no experience in that corporation or right, you don't have the industry experience yet and you don't have the functional experience yet. So I do think just from what I've observed, like getting into corporate strategy, it's typically people that at least have a couple years of like consulting or investment banking background. Again, I don't want to like generalize, right? My path was different. So I'm not saying that's the only way, but like that is what I've seen as like the most common way.
Okay, yeah, that's what I imagined, but thank you for clarifying that.
Yep.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. I would say if you're a management consultant, you have an advantage for maybe corporate strategy. And if you're an investment banker, you have an advantage for corporate development. Because both of them are going to do a little bit of both, but it's kind of like major minor. Corp strategy, major would be like strategy, maybe you support a transaction versus corp development. It'll be like mostly transactional work and then minor, a little bit of strategy.
Thank you.
And I saw this question from Chelsea in the chat a while ago, and she asked about changes you'd make early on in college. But I wanted to ask if any of you had just generally anything that you wish you picked up earlier in your careers, if not regrets, but opportunities you might have let pass by that you think, looking back, this is something that you want to tell current students to really look out for.
Your health. Your health. I think that is one of the biggest things that you forget about in college. And it doesn't hit you until you leave is like your health. And I think it's maintaining a healthy diet and making sure you get exercise in. Because once you enter into the corporate world, like Jonathan said, sometimes you're sitting at a desk for 10 hours a day, just staring at Excel and your eyes hurt. And you're just hungry. So you go and eat like McDonald's and it's terrible for you. And you start to like, it's not great for your well-being. And if you can start to build healthy habits now, I think it's going to last you a lifetime. And it's just even going for a walk, getting some light exercise in, eating well is going to be so helpful for you for the rest of your life. And I wish I knew that a lot sooner than I do now.
I think
Yeah,
also thinking that's so spot on. It's just like health, well-being, working in a place and for people who also value that, right? Like I think certain industries generally have, kind of some are more intense and it's kind of harder to maintain that kind of some of those healthy habits. But I also think just careers are long. And so, like, I think when you're coming out of school, right, you're like, okay, every semester it's like a big push, and then there's finals, and then I get this break. And it's like, your career isn't really like that. And so it's like, how can you make it sustainable for yourself? Like, I was so good at like kind of gaming the system and like working really hard and then getting this break. And it's like, how can you, careers are long and it's like, you cannot push for your whole career. So it's like, okay, is this a push job or kind of more of a coast job? Or is this going to be a push year for me or more of like a coast year? Like you are the only one who can kind of decide that for yourself. And there are different points in your career where it's going to make sense to take a big push job. Or maybe it's like, okay, I need to take this role because I have something going on in my personal life that has a little bit more flexibility or whatever that is. So think about that too. I know that everyone, here probably has a lot of career ambitions, but careers are long, so that balance is important.
what everybody said, I would just literally double tap on that. One, I started my college career trying to do a double major in computer science and finance. That was not the move. I think I was already burning that oil very quickly. And so that'd be one. And then two, same thing. I chose a career path right out of undergrad that I was working a lot of hours. And so I was able to take some time in between my roles. But exactly, like, what do you want from what role? At what point are you in your life? And what do you have going on in your personal life? And so as soon as I dropped computer science, which obviously my parents weren't very happy about because I was good at math in high school, I became I was able to focus on one thing and became good and was more balanced and joined more clubs and it was just the right decision.
Thanks
So
for that.
I was second all the panelists mentioned like having like maintain like a really sustainable lifestyle is important because like Lindy mentioned, like it's a long career, right? If you push yourself too hard, you could have burned out and you could have decided that I'm going to give up. You could be at that stage, and that's definitely not good for your health or for your career. So it's good to have like a paved, like sustainable path, and like whether it's like you paved out for yourself or it's like oh like oh you'll take a break after a push period. So that's like extremely important because yeah, like it's just going to be like 30 like 40 years in your career and just you just need to know like how to, really live the life well you have to work hard. And I think the other advice I would have is just be open-minded. There are so many, set forward paths, right? And you might think that, okay, I wanted to be prepared for a specific path going into that. But just always open-minded and just, like for example, this kind of like talks that we have, like just attend all of them, right? And then just learn about all the industries, even the ones that you're not interested, because you never know like where opportunities will lead you to. Like you might find an industry that you really liked, or in the future, like there might be a cross between like that industry and the area you're in. So just really preparing yourself, like knowing like as much as you can would be great when opportunity comes in the future. Like that's where like it will pay out.
Thank you for your advice, all of our panelists. I think health is always so important. We do, even as students, a lot of students will burn their bodies out because they feel young, but the effects will hit you later in life. And it looks like we have a hand from Soren if you wanted to ask your question.
Hello, thank you. So, I'm a sophomore, and maybe it's a little bit early to say, but I think I'm more interested in one of the more like analytical finance sort of investment banking type of roles. But a little bit late to like the recruiting track because I transferred. So, I was wondering if you had any advice for people uh who might not make the traditional recruiting cycle, having, like alternative paths into these really analytical intense finance positions.
Yeah, I actually got you because I was in the exact same shoes. So I didn't make it to kind of the traditional investment banking recruitment cycle because I was a little bit late to the game doing the computer science and finance. And what I actually did was I took an extra semester. And so I basically reclassified myself. So when I was a senior, I was actually a junior doing recruitment. I walked, did my internship, came back for a semester, had a semester off, then started. So that was because at the end of my sophomore year, I decided I wanted, or like, I had a little bit some finance interest, but I was like, at the end, right? It was like, and recruitment was already starting in like 3 months. And so even though I had built the infrastructure of like being in TIS and all of that, I was just so far behind my peers. And I only really realized that until I got into the mentorship program, which was like, Marshall's like, these are the top whatever juniors. But I was like, I felt so behind. And I was like, no, I'm gonna take my time and recruit next year.
I think obviously I'll let Jonathan, he knows more about investment banking specifically, but if I just like a general piece of advice, like you are not behind. You are a sophomore undergrad in college. Like
Yeah.
you are not behind. Like never feel behind. Like I remember like partway through college, I was like, oh, I kind of am interested in medicine. Like, should I be a doctor? I'm like, no, it's too late. Like it wasn't. Like no matter what you want to do, there will be enough time. Like maybe it's you have to get creative and do the extra semester thing, or maybe you have to go into like, maybe not a top tier firm right away and transfer in a year later. Like it is never too late, but like particularly for you all, for this audience, like you are not behind. So just like kind of figure out a way, work with career services, be like, hey, I'm feeling behind. Like, how can I want to do this? Like, how do I get there? Like you can, where there's a will, there's a way, in my opinion.
Yeah. She brings up a good point where you could also go to boutique, right? Like when I pushed back to an extra semester, I went to go work for a boutique investment bank called Capella Global. I did an unpaid internship, but I got investment banking experience. And so when I went for the bigger firms, I had an internship, right, for 6, 9 months. So where there's a will, there's a way. That's the perfect way. And so I would say extra semester, look into USC's progressive master's degrees. They have a bunch, 1 year, right? Maybe that'll give you, you can extend yourself, give yourself another degree. Look into an internship. You can also just do an internship and maybe you push back a semester. You just intern full time, right? There's lots of ways.
Thank you.
I think Lindy also hit it on the nose. Come to the Career Center. We have amazing advisors here, not just the US or the General Career Center, but for any Marshall students, Viterbi students, everywhere. Reach out to your advisors and see what they can do. They have a lot of experience working with students. And since you don't seem to have any other questions or hands from our students about anything, I just wanted to close off this Q&A panel asking for one piece of advice from each of our panelists, whether it's recruiting, college life, day-to-day basis, anything that you could say to this like audience that would maybe help them as they move forward in their journeys, wherever it takes them.
Yeah, I think hungry dogs run faster. I think we all went to USC and we all want to strive for excellence. And if you're hungry for it, you're going to run faster than everyone else. And it's okay that you don't know what you want to do, but once you figure it out, just be a hungry dog and you'll get there. And I firmly believe in all of you. I think that's why you went to USC and that's why you're here. So just remember that. And it's okay not to know what you want, but once you get there, you'll know.
I think my advice would be something that a mentor, like kind of in my early career, told me, and and just some other people close to me is like once you get in the job and you're in the job, like look at the people around you, look at your boss. Like, do you want that job? Do you like the lifestyle that they have? Is that someone like you would want to trade places with? I think that's a really important piece of advice to help you kind of understand, like, am I in the right place? Whether it's the company, the function. I think it's like, do I want my boss's job or do I want my boss's job? And like, is that someone that I like really look up to? Because I think it could be so hard, right? Like Grant mentioned, I think a lot of people here are hungry and eager, but it's like you want to make sure you're working for the right people, the right motives, and like it's someone that you would want to be one day. And if the answer to that is no, then it's like, okay, maybe I need to reevaluate the company or the team or the function. But I think kind of always staying true to like your moral compass is really helpful too.
Yes, literally what she said was the reason I left investment banking. I got a pretty good preview into some of like the partner's life and stuff, and I realized it really was a 7-day week, all demanding job. And I questioned the work-life balance and being able to sustain other items I wanted later on in my career path. And so that was just one of the reasons. I would say life is like a marathon. I'm currently training for a marathon. So some days you show up, have a terrible running session. Other days it's better. Other days I'm feeling heavy. Some days I feel like I'm extremely fast, but you just keep showing up and eventually you will get that medal of completion at the marathon at the end of it.
I would say just I know like a lot of pressures, right? From recruiting and then a lot of info session to attend, but you're still a student in college and that's the 4 years that you have in your life that you have the opportunities to explore, whatever you want, whatever you can outside of a professional job. So just fully enjoy and take advantage while you're at USC, right? Whether it's like attending tailgates or like just having like participating in different like student clubs, right? It doesn't have to be like TIS. It doesn't have to be like finance like focus, right? Just attending any clubs that you are your interest and just making friends and making connections. I think it's just that I felt like the piece of like advice that I have is just fully enjoy your like college career. Like it is going to be like the time that you'll kind of build yourself, like build your personality, like build your character, right? Like, and you can't really do that while you are like in a professional job. And also, like, everyone will have a job, right? And then it's going to be like last for like 50 years. So if you decide on an industry, it doesn't matter whether it's a very glamorous name or not, right? Like once you decide on an industry, you can always work towards the top. So I think it's important that you explore and you decide on what industry or what path you want to go forward, and then you have faith in yourself and like have perseverance and persistencies and then you'll eventually get there because it's going to be a long career.
And with that, I want to close up the panel thank you so thank you so much to our amazing, amazing panelists who took the time out of their day to come here and share your experience with all of us and all of your advice. And I want to also thank all of our students for attending the panel today. I hope this gave everyone who came a better understanding of the career paths that they have in front of them and potentially what they can do. And just to say, Industry Insights is a series of student-led panels designed for undergrads who want to explore different career paths. So some things we have coming up next semester, like startups, sports, art and design, a lot of different great fields. And I think one of our panelists did say, try to explore as much as you can. And so you can find other details about all the panels and events we host on Handshake. And I will go back if any of you want to reach out to our panelists on LinkedIn potentially. I want to give all of them a huge round of applause and a huge thank you for our panelists and attendees today. And with that, you are all free to go. Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody. Good luck.
Good luck, fight on.